Now, iOS is much harder to hack than Android, mainly because it's not open source, it's proprietary. And you can, as a third party, develop apps, but Apple has very strict rules, and they are very strict about vetting the apps that they put on the App Store. Nonetheless, there have been hacks. It is still possible. Let's take a look. The Apple iOS is the Apple mobile OS. It, like Android, has a user interface that uses direct touch manipulation, so touch gesture, like swipe and pinch and expand and things like that. The Apple iOS has its own architecture. It has basically 4 layers. There's the core operating system and services, and then there is the media support. Then there's something called the Cocoa Touch, which allows you to have that this sort of GUI interface. And then there are the apps. So if we look down here, we can see the iOS architecture. We can see the kernel and the device drivers in the core OS. And then we can see core services and the media support and the Cocoa Touch with the apps. So if we zoom in here, and like Android, you don't need to memorize this. Apple, for a very long time, has been based on a variant of FreeBSD. So you can see BSD right here. That's, what is it, Berkeley Socket Distribution? I can't remember what that stands for. So you've got the core BSD operating system, you've got file system, you've got networking, and you've got other device drivers here. Then you've got core parts of the OS that allow you to just do basic things, system configuration, managing disk and directory services, and media acceleration. Then you've got core services like social media, security, WebKit, Core Foundation, Core Data, Quick Look, Address Book. Some of these are Apple's little names for things. Then you've got the part that provides the media, like animation and text and audio and OpenGL and images. And then you've got Cocoa Touch, which is basically the thing that controls what we swipe on and what we pinch and expand and touch on and tap on. And the apps run right up here. So this is the iOS architecture. You can develop iOS apps. And like I said, Apple has strict rules for vetting and accepting apps to the Apple Store. You have to get a certificate from Apple. It's part of your developer license that is digitally signed by them. And Apple apps can only be distributed through the Apple Store. There is no sideloading. There's no such thing as sideloading unless we jailbreak, which we'll get to in a minute. There is one legal exception. That's the Apple Developer Enterprise Program. That allows a company to have a special license and developers to have a special license to develop in-house apps that are not distributed on the Apple Store. They are distributed in-house, and they're not for the general public. So that is an exception. And so here is an example of using the Apple Xcode development environment. There's also something called Swift. It's not part of this class to get into Apple code development, but you can see that you can develop apps and then you can see what they look like. Apple does have vulnerabilities. And this is true for iOS, which is for iPhone and iPad and iPod, and macOS, which is true for like Macintosh laptops and desktops. There is kernel memory corruption. Attackers could execute arbitrary code or cause a denial of service. It affects iOS versions prior to 11.3 or macOS versions prior to 10.13.4. It is CVE 2018. In other words, this is a 2018 vulnerability, 2018-4150. There is a vulnerability on the graphics driver. Again, we could execute arbitrary code or cause a denial of service. It affects iOS versions prior to 11.2.5. And it again is a 2018 vulnerability. There's the I/O mobile frame buffer vulnerability. This is a weakness in an extension of the kernel that is used to manage the screen frame buffer. and it allows attackers to execute arbitrary code. It affects iOS prior to 11.2. It's a 2017 vulnerability. Look at this. Look at how many vulnerabilities at this point were listed in 2017. Now, this is not Apple. This is like the whole world, every vendor, every product, every operating system. Almost 14,000. And I don't even know where if that was the final number. The only way this could be the final number was this was the very last vulnerability discovered in 2017. There's the High Sierra bug. It allows anyone to log into a macOS version High Sierra as root with no password. There's MacTans. You could plug your iPhone into this malicious USB charger, and it will inject persistent malware into your device through a malicious charger. That was demonstrated at a Black Hat conference. Of course, you can jailbreak an iPhone. When you jailbreak an iPhone, you are overriding the firmware. You are bypassing Apple's security controls, in other words, their digital signatures, because they digitally sign the firmware, and you have to, everything has to agree with that digital signature. So you're basically overriding this, bypassing the digital signatures, which gives you root privilege. You can uninstall or install anything you like, including malware, accidentally. And jailbroken iPhones typically open up an SSH server backdoor. And you can look up the username and password on the internet. What does SSH listen on? We know that, TCP/22, which means you could do a Wi-Fi scan for TCP/22, or even a cellular scanner, the phone number, for TCP/22, and just look up, like for the Apple IVs, the default username, of course, is always root, and the password was Alpine. So most one-click jailbreaks are themselves suspect of installing bots and rats. There's something called Thunderstrike. This is a hardware-based bootkit that overwrites the OS X firmware. It spreads through maliciously modified peripheral devices that plug into the Thunderbolt interface. Thunderbolt is similar to the DP interface. It's like a high-speed interface. You typically plug monitors into it, but it doesn't have to be. You could plug other things into them. There's the iCloud API vulnerability. This is a series of iCloud attacks called Celebgate, which led to the theft of about 500 private celebrity photos and exposed a weakness in the iCloud API that would allow unlimited password brute forcing. There's Mac Control Backdoor. This is an advanced persistent threat backdoor that has multiple variations and delivery tools. It connects to a command and control center, a CNC, in China to receive instructions. In other words, you become a bot. As with Android, iOS uses sandboxes. And every app has its own little set of documents. There's the app, its little libraries of functionality, and its little temp directories. So every app has its own sandbox here. So you can see Apple is not without vulnerabilities, and this only lists the most recent ones.